February 1847, a magistrate's clerk in Charleston, South Carolina, recorded something in the county ledger that would be deliberately erased within a week. 3 plantation estates along the Cooper River were being dissolved after their owner's sudden death, and the state needed to catalog every asset, including the enslaved population. What they found defied every assumption about isolation, language, and human memory. 47 enslaved individuals spanning 3 generations spoke French with a fluency and sophistication that stunned linguists brought from Charleston's French, Huguenot community, not broken Creole, not Pidgin. Fragments pure grammatically perfect French with regional dialects from northern France, specifically Normandy and Brittany. Here's what made it impossible. Genealogical records confirmed none of these families had ever left the property. Not one person, not for 3 generations. No French visitors were ever documented. No French-speaking overseers. No books in French anywhere on the estate. The plantation owner himself, a man named Thomas Grayson, spoke only English and knew no French whatsoever. When pressed, the eldest among them, a woman of perhaps 70 years, claimed their French came from the lessons in the cellar. But there was no cellar on the property, just red clay and bedrock. The magistrate's office sealed the records. The families were separated and sold to different buyers across 3 states, and the ledger entry vanished as if it had never existed. But someone kept detailed notes. Hidden in Charleston's Historical Society archives is a leather journal that shouldn't be there, written in 2 languages, documenting what actually happened on Grayson's plantation in the decades before that impossible discovery. Before we continue with the story of Thomas Grayson's plantation and the mystery that authorities tried to bury, I want to invite you to join our community of truth seekers. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Real historical mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from right now? I love knowing where our community spans across this country. Now, let's uncover what really happened along the Cooper River. The discovery didn't truly begin in 1847. It began with a question someone asked 30 years earlier. Thomas Grayson purchased his plantation property in 1809, a 600-acre tract of prime rice-growing land along the Cooper River, 15 mi north of Charleston proper. He was a 3rd-generation South Carolinian, his grandfather having arrived from England in the 1730s. The Graysons were known as competent but unremarkable planters, neither particularly wealthy nor destitute, maintaining a modest prosperity through rice and some timber. Thomas himself was a methodical man, a widower who kept detailed account books and ran his operations with strict routine, but without the legendary cruelty that marked some of his neighbors' estates. When Thomas purchased the property, it came with 42 enslaved individuals, families who had worked that land for decades under the previous owner, a Dutchman named Cornelius Vandermir, who had died without heirs. Thomas knew little about Vandermir except that he had been reclusive, rarely visiting Charleston, and had operated the plantation with minimal staff and even fewer visitors. The property was isolated even by the standards of the time, accessible only by river or via a poorly maintained wagon road that turned to swamp in heavy rain. The enslaved community consisted of several family lines: the Baptists, the Larue family, the Dutchan, and a few others whose names would eventually be anglicized in record books beyond recognition. They worked the rice fields, maintained the modest plantation house, and kept largely to themselves, as was their only option. Their quarters were a collection of small cabins along the northern edge of the property, simple structures of wood and clay, each housing a family unit. Among them was a woman named Marguerite, though plantation records listed her as Maggie, who served in the main house and was already elderly when Thomas took possession of the property. Thomas Grayson noticed something peculiar within his first month. While supervising the rice fields one afternoon, he overheard 2 workers speaking in a language he didn't recognize. It wasn't the Gula Creole common among enslaved populations in the low country, that musical blend of English and West African languages. This was something different, flowing and rhythmic with sounds that felt European. When he questioned them, they immediately switched to English, their faces carefully neutral. He dismissed it, assuming it was some dialect he simply didn't know, but the moments accumulated. A snatch of conversation between women hanging laundry. An elderly man murmuring something over a cook fire. Children whispering to each other before they noticed his approach. Always that same unfamiliar language, always immediately silenced when discovered. Thomas was not a curious man by nature, but he was methodical and the pattern disturbed him. He asked his few neighbors about it during a dinner in Charleston. They shrugged. Field workers often had their own languages, fragments brought from Africa, mixed and changed over time. Why did it matter what they spoke among themselves? It mattered to Thomas because of what happened in late autumn of 1809, just 9 months after he'd purchased the property. An enslaved child, a boy of perhaps 6 named Pierre, called Peter in Thomas's ledgers, was injured when a rice winnowing basket shattered and sent wooden splinters into his arm. The wound became infected, and within days the boy was delirious with fever. Thomas, who prided himself on maintaining his property, and therefore his workforce, sent for a doctor from Charleston. While they waited for the physician's arrival, Thomas entered the boy's cabin to assess the situation. The child was burning with fever, mumbling continuously. His mother knelt beside him, whispering urgently, and Thomas Grayson, standing in that doorway, heard the child speak entire, complex sentences in what he would later learn was perfect French. Not fragments, not jumbled words, clear, grammatically sophisticated French, the kind spoken in drawing rooms and universities. The mother noticed Thomas and fell silent, her eyes wide with something that looked like terror. The doctor arrived, bled the boy according to the medical practice of the time, applied a pus, and the fever eventually broke. The child survived, but Thomas couldn't forget what he'd heard. He knew what French sounded like, even if he couldn't speak it himself. Charleston had a significant Huguenot population, descendants of French Protestants who'd fled religious persecution. French was the language of diplomacy, education, culture. It wasn't something a 6-year-old enslaved child on an isolated plantation should know, let alone speak fluently in his delirium. Thomas began to pay attention, real attention. Over the following months, he confirmed his suspicion. His entire enslaved population spoke French among themselves, not as a secondary language, as their primary language. They used English when necessary, when addressing him or conducting plantation business, but among themselves, French flowed as naturally as breathing. Mothers sang to their children in French. Elderly men told stories in French. Arguments erupted in rapid colloquial French that sounded like it came from people who'd spent their lives in France itself. The impossibility of this haunted Thomas Grayson. These families had been on this property for decades, some of them born here. The genealogical records Vandermir had kept were meticulous. Thomas had studied them during the property transfer. None of these individuals had ever been transported away from this plantation. None had been purchased from French colonies in the Caribbean. Their lineage traced back to West Africa through the Charleston slave markets of the 1760s and 1770s. There should be no French. There couldn't be French. And yet in 1810, Thomas did something unusual. He invited a linguistics professor from the College of Charleston, a Huguenot descendant named Jean-Baptiste Rouse, to visit his plantation under the pretense of documenting local Gula dialects for academic study. Professor Rousseau spent 3 days on the property, ostensibly recording field songs and common phrases. What he actually documented shook him so thoroughly that he wrote a private letter to Thomas afterward, a letter Thomas kept locked in his desk for the rest of his life. Professor Rouse confirmed that the enslaved population spoke French. Not Louisiana French, not Haitian Creole, but continental French with regional markers indicating Norman and Breton origins, dialects from northern coastal France. He noted vocabulary that was archaic even by 1810 standards, suggesting the French being spoken predated the Revolution of 1789. He recorded grammatical constructions that educated Parisians would have used in the mid to late 1700s. He documented oral traditions, stories, and songs that referenced places in Normandy, specific villages, specific geographical features that no one in South Carolina should have known. In his letter, Professor Rousseau wrote, "Mr. Grayson, I cannot explain what I witnessed. These individuals speak French as native speakers, not as students who learned it, not as speakers of a degraded dialect. They speak as though they grew up in France itself. Moreover, they possess cultural knowledge, songs, folktales, regional expressions that could only be acquired through deep immersion in French rural culture. I asked the elder woman. The one called Maggie, where they learned their French. She told me they learned from the Professor Dunoir, the teachers in the darkness. When I pressed her for clarity, she became agitated and would say no more. Mr. Grayson, I advise you to treat this matter with utmost discretion. What I encountered defies rational explanation, and in these times of unrest and superstition, such inexplicable circumstances could bring unwanted attention to your property. Thomas took that advice. He stopped asking questions, at least overtly. He never spoke of the matter to his neighbors again, but he listened. He watched, and slowly, over years, fragments of an explanation began to emerge, though he would never fully understand it. The key lay in the previous owner, Cornelius Vandermir, and in something that had happened in the decades before Thomas ever purchased the property. What Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because Vandermeer's personal papers had been destroyed before the estate sale, was that something extraordinary had occurred on this plantation between 1782 and 1791. Something that Vandermeer documented meticulously, then deliberately erased from all official records before his death. Cornelius Vandermir had purchased the property in 1775, just as tensions between the colonies and Britain reached breaking point. He was a Dutch merchant who'd made his fortune in Atlantic trade, and he bought the plantation as a refuge, a place to wait out the political chaos. He was also a man with unusual ideas about human capability and learning, ideas shaped by Enlightenment philosophy and by his own strange obsessions. Vandermeer believed, and he wrote this in journals he kept in Dutch, journals that would not be found until much later, that human beings were capable of far more intellectual development than society allowed, regardless of their circumstances. He'd been influenced by French philosophers, particularly Rousseau's ideas about natural human potential and the corruption of civilization. Vandermeer developed a theory that language and culture could be transmitted perfectly, like a candle lighting another candle if the conditions were precisely controlled. In 1782, something happened that gave Vandermeer an opportunity to test his theory. A French ship fleeing British naval pursuit foundered in a storm off the Carolina coast. The ship, the Marie Claire, out of San Malo, was carrying refugees from a failed colonial venture in what would become Haiti. Wealthy French planters and their families fleeing slave uprisings and yellow fever. The ship broke apart on a sandbar near the mouth of the Cooper River. Most aboard drowned, but several survivors made it to shore. Among them was a man named Philippe Laurent, a school teacher from Normandy and Brittany, and his wife Cecile, a woman who taught at a girls' school in San Malo. They were educated middle-class French citizens who'd been traveling to Martinique to take teaching positions. They'd lost everything in the shipwreck: documents, belongings, proof of identity. They were destitute, stranded, and in a precarious legal position as French citizens in a region still caught in revolutionary war. Cornelius Vandermeer found them on his property, exhausted and desperate, and made them an offer that they, given their circumstances, could hardly refuse. He would shelter them, provide them with resources, and eventually arrange for their passage back to Europe. In exchange, they would undertake an educational experiment that Vandermeer would design. The nature of that experiment would become clear soon enough. Vandermeer's enslaved population at that time consisted of several family groups, approximately 35 individuals, including children. His proposal was this: the Laurents would teach this population French language and French culture, reading, writing, literature, history, music, manners, as though they were educating the children of French bourgeoisie. They would create a comprehensive curriculum. They would treat their students as capable minds. Vandermeer wanted to see if enslaved individuals given rigorous education could achieve the same intellectual sophistication as any educated European. It was an experiment in human potential, and also, though Vandermeer never admitted this, an act of profound cruelty disguised as enlightenment. Philip and Cecile Laurent, trapped and dependent on Vandermeer's goodwill, agreed. Beginning in late 1782, they began teaching. Vandermeer constructed a building for this purpose. He called it the schoolhouse, though in later records it would be listed only as storage on the northern section of the property. Classes were held 6 days a week. Adults and children alike attended. The Lawrence taught reading and writing, mathematics, French history, geography of France, even Latin. They taught French songs and poems. They instructed in manners and social graces of French society. They created in effect a French village school in the South Carolina Low Country, hidden on a plantation that few outsiders ever visited. The Lawrence were skilled teachers, and they were teaching students with strong motivation. The enslaved population understood, perhaps better than Vandermeer realized, that education was a form of resistance, a preservation of self. They learned with intensity. Children who'd never held a book became fluent readers. Adults who'd known only fieldwork discussed philosophy. Within 3 years, Vandermeer's enslaved population spoke French as their primary language and possessed cultural knowledge that would have qualified them for educated society in France itself. But in 1785, something went wrong. Philippe Laurent fell ill with malaria. He died within a week. Cécile, devastated and now truly alone, continued teaching for several more months, but her grief made her increasingly unstable. She began speaking of the immorality of their situation, of how they'd participated in something that propped up an evil system. She threatened to leave to go to Charleston and tell authorities what Vandermeer had done. Vandermeer couldn't allow that. What he'd done was legally ambiguous at best, potentially dangerous at worst. Teaching enslaved people to read and write was illegal in South Carolina, though the law was inconsistently enforced. But more than legal concerns, Vandermeer feared his experiment becoming public knowledge. It would raise too many uncomfortable questions about human nature, about the justifications for slavery, about capability and circumstance. One morning in December 1785, Cécile Laurent's body was found at the base of the bluff overlooking the river. Official cause of death: accidental fall. Vandermeer arranged for a quick burial in an unmarked grave on the property. He destroyed all of her personal papers, all of the educational materials the Lawrence had created. Every trace of the experiment, except the knowledge that now lived in the minds of his enslaved population. And then Vandermeer made a decision that revealed the depth of his obsession. Rather than trying to suppress the French language among his workforce, he encouraged it. He wanted to see if the knowledge would perpetuate itself, if the first generation of educated individuals would transmit their learning to the next generation with fidelity. He wanted to see if cultural transmission could occur perfectly in isolation. He documented everything in his private journals, noting vocabulary retention, grammatical accuracy, cultural practice preservation. He treated his enslaved population like specimens in an ongoing experiment, all while maintaining the outward appearance of a conventional plantation owner. The population cooperated, not because they cared about Vandermeer's experiment, but because the French language had become theirs. It was their secret, their community bond, their act of cultural preservation. They taught their children French, not as Vandermeer's subjects, but as their own choice. They maintained the knowledge the Lawrence had given them because it was valuable, because it was beautiful, because it was something that couldn't be taken from them as long as they held it in their minds and passed it to their children. This continued for 24 years. 3 generations learned perfect in isolation on a South Carolina plantation. And then in 1809, Cornelius Vandermir suffered a stroke. He died 3 days later, taking his secrets with him. Before his death, lucid enough to know what was coming, he burned his journals. He burned the Laurent's belongings, which he'd kept stored. He destroyed every physical trace of what had happened. All that remained was the knowledge itself, alive in the people he'd treated as his grand experiment. Thomas Grayson would never learn most of this history. He knew there had been an experiment. He knew the Lawrence had existed. He found brief mentions in property records, references to French educators employed briefly in the 1780s, but he never understood the full scope of what Vandermeer had done. What Thomas did understand was that he now owned people who possessed dangerous knowledge. Literacy was problematic enough. French language and French culture suggested connection to revolutionary ideals, to hate, to concepts of liberty and equality that were explosive in their implications. For nearly 3 decades, Thomas maintained an uneasy equilibrium. He allowed the French to continue privately, never openly acknowledged it, and in exchange, his workforce remained orderly and productive. The families kept their secret. The children born on the plantation grew up speaking French as their first language, English as their second. They preserved stories and songs, maintained oral traditions, kept alive the memory of Philip and Cecil Laurent as mythical figures, benefactors who'd given them an incredible gift. Among the families, the Baptists emerged as the primary keepers of the tradition. The matriarch, the woman Thomas knew as Maggie, but who was called Marguerite within the community, had been a young woman when the Laurents first arrived. She'd learned to read from Cecil Laurent herself. She'd memorized entire books. In her cabin, hidden beneath floorboards, she kept a small collection of items she'd saved. A single book in French, a religious text the Laurents had used for teaching, and several papers with handwritten notes in Cecil's script. These were sacred objects, treasured and protected. Marguerite taught her daughter Emily, who in turn taught her own children. The transmission was faithful. Professor Rousseau's assessment in 1810 had been accurate. The French spoken on Grayson's plantation was pristine, grammatically sophisticated, culturally rich. It hadn't degraded or creolized over the decades. If anything, it had been preserved with almost religious devotion. But secrets create pressure, and pressure eventually finds cracks. In 1823, something happened that tested the community's ability to maintain silence. A young man named Jacques, called Jack in plantation records, fell in love with a woman named Marie, who'd been purchased from a neighboring plantation. Marie spoke Guilla Creole and English, no French. Jacques taught her French, courting her in the language of his community, and Marie proved a quick student. Within a year, she was conversant, if not fluent. Marie's former owner, a planter named Daniels, visited Grayson's property in 1824 to discuss a business matter concerning shared use of a rice mill. While there, he encountered Marie and attempted to speak with her. She responded in French, not intentionally, but automatically, as she'd been speaking French with Jacques moments before. Daniels was stunned. He questioned Thomas Grayson sharply. Why was one of his former slaves now speaking French? What peculiar practices was Grayson engaging in? Was he educating his workforce? That was illegal, he reminded Thomas. Thomas diffused the situation by claiming Marie had picked up fragments of French from a Charleston Huguenot woman who'd briefly visited to conduct religious instruction. A fiction he invented on the spot. Daniel seemed skeptical but let the matter drop. However, the incident frightened Thomas. He realized how fragile his secret was, how easily it could become public. He instituted a strict rule. French was only to be spoken in the quarters, never where visitors might overhear. The community complied, but the close call had shaken everyone. The years passed. Thomas grew older. The rice plantation remained profitable, but required constant maintenance and labor. The political landscape shifted, nullification crisis, growing abolitionist sentiment in the North, increasing tension over slavery's future. The enslaved population on Grayson's plantation continued their dual existence, field workers in English, French speakers in privacy. Children were born, elderly died, life cycled through generations with the French language as the constant, the thread connecting them to something larger than their circumstances. Thomas never married again, never had children. His nephew, a young man named William Grayson, visited occasionally from Charleston, but Thomas kept him distant from the day-to-day operations of the plantation. Thomas was afraid that William, less discreet, might discover the French and react poorly. Thomas had grown protective of his secret, even though it wasn't truly his. He understood that the knowledge his workforce possessed was remarkable, unprecedented, and potentially dangerous to all involved. In 1846, Thomas Grayson suffered from what appeared to be a series of small strokes. His health declined rapidly. By December of that year, he was bedridden. He knew he was dying. In January 1847, in a moment of clarity, he made a decision that would destroy the very secret he'd protected for decades. Thomas wrote a letter to the Charleston Linguistic Society, the same organization that had employed Professor Rousseau decades earlier. In the letter, he described the French-speaking enslaved population on his plantation and requested that scholars document this phenomenon before it was lost. He claimed he wanted the knowledge preserved for scientific purposes. Perhaps he wanted validation for the decades he'd spent maintaining this strange secret. Perhaps he felt guilt and wanted someone to know. Perhaps he simply wanted to matter, to be remembered for something unusual. The letter was delivered 3 days after Thomas Grayson died in his sleep. His nephew William inherited the property and immediately set about liquidating assets. The plantation was heavily in debt. William needed cash. The timing was catastrophic. The state magistrate's office became involved in the estate dissolution because of the debts. When the property was being cataloged for auction, a junior clerk named Samuel Winters accompanied the magistrate to conduct the assessment. Samuel was methodical, educated, and observant. He was also fluent in French, having studied it at the College of Charleston. On a cold February morning, Samuel walked through the enslaved quarters with his ledger, recording names and estimated values for the coming estate sale. What happened next? He recorded in a personal diary that would eventually end up in Charleston's Historical Society archives through a grandson's donation. In 1891, Samuel heard French being spoken. Not fragments, not pidgin, perfect flowing French. A woman was scolding 2 children for tracking mud into a cabin. An elderly man was telling a story to a small group, gesturing expressively. Samuel stopped walking. He stood absolutely still and listened. The French was impeccable, grammar, vocabulary, accent. He heard regional pronunciations from northern France. He heard idiomatic expressions he'd studied in advanced coursework. Samuel approached the elderly man, Margaret's brother, a man of perhaps 65, and addressed him in French. "Excuse France." "Excuse me, sir, where did you learn French?" The man, startled, stared at Samuel. Then, perhaps sensing something in Samuel's tone, genuine curiosity rather than threat, he responded, "Teachers who came when I was a child. They taught us as if we were their own children. My sister remembers better than I do." Samuel spent the next 2 hours speaking with Marguerite, who at this point was approximately 70 years old. The conversation, which Samuel recorded in his diary, revealed fragments of the true history. Marguerite told him about the French couple, though she didn't know their full story. She knew they'd come from the sea, that they'd taught the plantation's population for several years, that they treated their students with respect and affection. She knew the woman had died tragically and was buried somewhere on the property, though she didn't know where. She knew the old Master Vandermir had encouraged the lessons, and then after the teachers were gone had wanted the community to maintain the French language. Marguerite told Samuel that speaking French had become their identity, their bond. It was what made them a community rather than just a collection of individuals forced to work the same land. She said that mothers taught children with the same care the original teachers had shown, that preserving the language was seen as a sacred duty. She showed Samuel the hidden book and papers, the treasures kept beneath her cabin's floorboards. Samuel was astonished. He recognized the historical and linguistic significance of what he'd discovered. When he returned to the magistrate's office and reported his findings, he expected scholarly interest. Perhaps even celebration of this remarkable example of cultural preservation and human intellectual capacity. Instead, he encountered alarm. The magistrate, a man named Horace Petton, immediately understood the implications. An enslaved population that spoke perfect, that was literate, that possessed cultural sophistication. This was politically explosive. The abolitionist movement in the North frequently argued that enslaved people were intellectually equal to whites and deserved freedom on that basis. Southern defenders of slavery countered that enslaved people lacked the capacity for civilization and required paternal oversight. Grayson's plantation workers demolished that argument simply by existing. Moreover, there were practical concerns. If word spread that these individuals spoke French and were literate, their value at auction would plummet. Buyers feared educated slaves as potential rebels, troublemakers, flight risks. William Grayson, already dealing with his uncle's debts, would lose significant money, and Charleston's planter class, more broadly, would face uncomfortable questions. Magistrate Pemberton made a decision. He would allow scholars to quietly document this phenomenon for private academic record, but the information would not be made public. The estate sale would proceed normally, without mention of the French language skills. The families would be separated and sold to different buyers across multiple states, diluting the concentration of French speakers and making the phenomenon less noticeable. And the official records would be altered to remove any reference to this discovery. Samuel Winters objected. He argued for transparency, for scholarly documentation, for recognition of what these families had achieved. Petton was unmoved. Samuel was threatened with dismissal and potential legal action for interfering in estate matters. Faced with that pressure, Samuel complied outwardly, but privately he began keeping meticulous notes. The Charleston Linguistic Society, having received Thomas Grayson's letter, sent a delegation to investigate. 2 scholars arrived, Dr. Anton Mirier, a Huguenot descendant and French literature professor, and Dr. Edwin Houet, a linguist specializing in dialect preservation. They were given limited access to the plantation under strict supervision. They spent 3 days conducting interviews, recording vocabulary, documenting songs and stories. What they found confirmed and expanded Samuel's discovery. Dr. Mercier, in particular, was deeply moved. He wrote in his field notes, "I am speaking with individuals who command French at a level equivalent to educated Parisians of the previous century. They know literature, history, geography of France. They sing songs from Brittany and Normandy that I learned from my grandmother. They possess a cultural heritage that should be impossible given their circumstances. This is either the most remarkable example of human intellectual resilience I have ever encountered, or there is a mechanism of transmission we do not yet understand." Dr. Houet focused on the linguistic analysis. He documented that the French spoken included archaic vocabulary and grammatical structures that had fallen out of use in France itself by the 1840s, suggesting that the French had been preserved unchanged from whenever it was initially learned. He noted Norman and Breton regional markers, confirming geographic origins of the original speakers. He recorded that the community had even maintained distinctions between formal and informal registers of speech, something that required sophisticated understanding of social context. Both scholars wanted to publish their findings. They prepared a joint paper for presentation at the American Philosophical Society, but Magistrate Petton intervened. He visited the scholars privately and explained the political situation. Publication would create problems for everyone involved. For William Grayson, for Charleston's social order, for the scholars themselves, who might face accusations of promoting abolitionist propaganda. Petton suggested the scholars keep their findings private for now, perhaps to be revealed at a more appropriate time in the future. Dr. Mercier refused. He believed this discovery was too important to suppress. Dr. Hathaway, more politically cautious, reluctantly agreed to delay publication. The partnership fractured. Dr. Mirier returned to Charleston determined to proceed with documenting this phenomenon, while Dr. Hathaway withdrew from the project. Then 2 weeks after the scholars' visit, something happened that would seal the secret for over a century. Dr. Anton Mercer was found dead in his study at the College of Charleston on March 3, 1847. Official cause, heart failure. He was 47 years old and had been in excellent health. His field notes from the plantation visit were missing. His draft paper was gone. The only items remaining related to his research were a few scattered vocabulary lists that without context meant nothing. Samuel Winters attended the funeral. Afterward, he spoke quietly with Dr. Mercier's widow, Elizabeth. She told Samuel something that made his blood run cold. 2 nights before his death, Anton had come home agitated. He said someone had visited him at his office, a man he wouldn't name, and threatened him. If Anton published anything about Grayson's plantation, there would be consequences. Anton had laughed it off, told Elizabeth that in a free republic, scholarship couldn't be suppressed by threats. The next evening, he'd complained of feeling unwell. By morning, he was dead. Elizabeth believed her husband had been murdered, but she had no proof, no witnesses, no leverage. When she tried to convince authorities to investigate, she was gently but firmly discouraged. Dr. Mercier's death was deemed natural. The matter was closed. Samuel Winters became afraid. He realized that forces with considerable influence wanted this discovery buried. He considered destroying his own notes, distancing himself from the entire affair. But something in him resisted. He thought about Marguerite, about the families who'd preserved their culture with such dedication. He thought about the murdered teacher Cecile Laurent, who tried to speak truth and died for it. He thought about Dr. Mercier, who'd valued knowledge over safety. Samuel made copies of everything he documented. He created a secret journal, writing in both English and French, detailing everything he'd witnessed, every conversation he'd had, every observation he'd made. He included his own speculation about what had really happened on Vandermir's plantation, drawing connections from fragments of information he'd gathered. He hid this journal among his personal papers with instructions that it should be preserved, but not opened until after his death. Then Samuel did something unexpected. He visited William Grayson. William was a practical man, frustrated by his uncle's debts and eager to liquidate the plantation assets. He had no interest in mysteries or linguistics or his uncle's strange household. But he was also a businessman who understood value. Samuel proposed something. If William could discreetly provide information about his uncle's papers, particularly anything related to the previous owner, Vandermir, Samuel would help ensure the estate sale proceeded smoothly, without public attention to the French-speaking workforce. William agreed. He gave Samuel access to Thomas Grayson's private desk, which contained decades of correspondence and records. Most of it was mundane accounts, business letters, crop records, but locked in a drawer was the letter Professor Russo had written in 1810. The letter describing his linguistic findings and mentioning the teachers in the darkness. There were also brief notes in Thomas's hand, fragments of observation about the French he'd heard over the years, and a cryptic mention of Vandermeer's experiment. Samuel copied everything. He began piecing together the larger picture. The French couple, the educational experiment, Vandermeer's obsession with cultural transmission, Thomas Grayson's decades of protective silence, the pattern of suppression, and now active measures to prevent public knowledge. The estate sale proceeded in late March 1847. 47 individuals were sold to 17 different buyers from South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Families were deliberately separated. The Baptists were split. Marguerite was purchased by a cotton planter in central Georgia. Her daughter Emily went to a rice plantation in the low country. Her grandchildren were divided among 3 different buyers. The community that had maintained perfect French for 3 generations was shattered in a single afternoon. Samuel Winters watched the auction with a profound sense of loss. He tried to convince Magistrate Petton to at least keep families together, but his appeals were ignored. The separation was strategic. Scattered individuals speaking French to themselves would attract no attention. A community of French speakers was a threat. Before Marguerite was taken away by her new owner, Samuel managed to speak with her briefly. He told her he was sorry. She looked at him with eyes that held decades of dignity and grief, and she said in French, "What we know cannot be sold. As long as one of us remembers, we exist." Samuel never saw her again, but her words haunted him for the rest of his life. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in this story intensifies, not from supernatural forces, but from human choices. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The official records were altered exactly as Magistrate Petton had ordered. The ledger entry describing the French-speaking population was erased with such thoroughness that chemical analysis would later reveal the page had been scraped and rewritten. The scholars' reports were confiscated or destroyed. Dr. Mercier's death was ruled natural and forgotten. The estate sale proceeded, the families scattered, and Charleston society moved on as though nothing remarkable had occurred. But information like water finds cracks. Over the following months, rumors circulated. Whispers in Charleston's Huguenot community about enslaved people who spoke perfect French. Speculation at the College of Charleston about what Dr. Mercier had discovered before his death. quiet conversations among plantation owners about strange happenings on the old Grayson property. William Grayson, having sold the plantation itself to a buyer from Virginia, wanted no part of these rumors. He publicly denied any knowledge of French-speaking workers, claimed his uncle had been eccentric and given to exaggeration in his final illness, and threatened legal action against anyone spreading what he called fantastical lies designed to stir abolitionist sentiment. The suppression was largely successful. By 1850, the story had faded from active discussion. Most people who'd been directly involved had moved on or died. Dr. Hathaway never published his research. Samuel Winters continued his work as a clerk, keeping his secret journal hidden, adding occasional notes when he learned fragments of information about what had happened to the scattered families. But one person refused to let the truth disappear entirely. Elizabeth Merrier, Dr. Mercier's widow, spent years gathering her late husband's surviving papers, interviewing anyone who might have information, and piecing together the full story. She never published her findings. She knew what had happened to her husband and feared for her own safety. But she created a comprehensive document, a combination of her husband's field notes, Samuel Winters's testimonies, property records, and her own research. In 1863, as Charleston was under siege during the Civil War and the world of plantation slavery was collapsing, Elizabeth Mercier donated her entire collection of documents to the Charleston Library Society with specific instructions. The materials were to be sealed for 50 years. She marked the collection with a cryptic title, The Loron Papers, a study in cultural transmission and willful amnesia. The collection was catalogued, placed in archive storage, and promptly forgotten in the chaos of war and Reconstruction. When the 50-year seal expired in 1913, no one remembered the collection existed. It sat in storage, a leather portfolio among thousands of documents awaiting discovery. The scattered families carried their French forward as far as they could. Some managed to pass the language to one more generation. Others, isolated and surrounded by English speakers, saw the French fade within a decade. A few maintained fragments, words, phrases, lullabies that persisted for another generation or two before dissolving into family stories about ancestors who'd spoken a mysterious language. Marguerite Baptiste died in Georgia in 1854. Her obituary recorded in her owner's property ledger listed her as Maggie House Servant, age approximately 77. There was no mention of her intellect, her linguistic abilities, her role as keeper of a remarkable cultural tradition. She was reduced to a line item in an account book. Her daughter Emily survived longer, dying in 1869. By then, slavery had ended and Emily was free. Though freedom brought its own hardships, she worked as a nurse in Beaufort, South Carolina. She taught her children French when she could, but the language had no practical value in their new lives. They needed English to survive. The French became a secret again, then a memory, then a curiosity, then nothing. The book and papers that Marguerite had treasured, hidden beneath her cabin's floorboards, remained there when the plantation was sold. Years later, when the old quarters were torn down to make room for new construction, a workman found the items. Not recognizing their significance, he burned them with other debris. The last physical evidence of the Loron's legacy turned to ash in a bonfire. Samuel Winters died in 1872 at age 53. His secret journal, as he'd instructed, was preserved by his family, but not examined. His children, respecting his wishes, placed it in a trunk with other family papers. The trunk, passed through generations, eventually donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1921 by a great-granddaughter cleaning out an estate. The journal was catalogued as S. Winters' personal diary, 1847-1872, and shelved. It wasn't until 1968 that a graduate student researching Charleston's antebellum economy for a dissertation randomly pulled Samuel Winters's journal from the archives. The student, intrigued by the French passages and the strange story they told, brought the journal to her advisor's attention. Cross-referencing with other historical society materials, they discovered Elizabeth Mercier's sealed collection. The 50-year seal had long since expired, but no one had ever opened the portfolio. The two collections together revealed the full story. The shipwrecked teachers, Vandermeer's experiment, the 3 generations of perfect French maintained in isolation, Thomas Grayson's protective silence, the discovery in 1847, Dr. Mercier's murder disguised as natural death, the deliberate destruction of evidence, the separation and scattering of families, the systematic suppression of one of the most remarkable examples of cultural transmission and human intellectual resilience in American history. The graduate student published her findings in an obscure academic journal in 1969. The paper attracted minimal attention. The civil rights movement was in full force. Academic discussions of 19th-century linguistic phenomena seemed quaint and irrelevant. A few linguists and historians noted the case, filed it away as an interesting footnote, and moved on. The old Grayson Plantation property by 1970 had changed hands multiple times. The land had been subdivided, developed, transformed. The original plantation house had burned in 1891. The quarters where French-speaking families had lived were long gone. A modern housing development occupied the northern section where Vandermeer's schoolhouse had once stood. The southern portion along the river was industrial warehouses and a small marina. No markers indicated what had once happened there. In 1973, a historical preservation group attempted to have the site recognized for its linguistic and educational significance. The application was denied. The site had no remaining historical structures, and the story itself, while fascinating, was deemed too difficult to verify and too politically sensitive. Better to let it remain an academic footnote. And so it has. Today, most people who live on that land along the Cooper River have no idea what occurred there. The families who descended from Marguerite, Emily, Jacques, and the others have scattered across the country, and most don't know their ancestors spoke perfect on a South Carolina plantation. The language died with the last speakers sometime in the early 20th century, leaving no native descendants. What remains are documents. Samuel Winters's journal, Elizabeth Mercier's collection, property records, auction papers, and fragments of testimony. They tell the story of what happens when human capability meets oppressive circumstance. When intellectual achievement is seen as threat rather than triumph, when knowledge is suppressed because it challenges comfortable assumptions. The Lurons' graves were never found. Cecile, who died trying to do the right thing, lies somewhere on that property unmarked and forgotten. Philippa, buried hastily after dying from malaria, suffered the same fate. Cornelius Vandermir, who created the conditions for this extraordinary experiment, and then destroyed evidence of it, was buried in Charleston's Huguenot Cemetery, with a handsome stone marker that makes no mention of his most significant legacy. Thomas Grayson's marker stands in the same cemetery. His epitaph reads, "A faithful steward." The irony, given that he stewarded one of the most unusual and suppressed stories in American history, would likely please him. He wanted to be remembered for something significant. He is by the few who know. The question that haunted everyone involved remains unanswered. Was this a triumph of human intellect and cultural resilience? Or was it an exploitation of desperate teachers and captive students for one man's philosophical vanity? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that ambiguity is precisely why the story was suppressed. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of heroism or villain. It's messy, complicated, profoundly human. The families who spoke perfect French for 3 generations on that isolated plantation achieved something remarkable. They maintained sophisticated knowledge under impossible circumstances. They transmitted culture with fidelity across generations. They proved human intellectual capacity under conditions designed to deny it. And then they were scattered and silenced. Their achievement deliberately erased because it was inconvenient to acknowledge. This mystery shows us that some of history's most profound truths are hidden not by accident, but by intention, buried by people who find those truths threatening. What do you think of this story? Do you believe it really happened, or is it too extraordinary to be true? Leave your comment below. I want to know what you think. And if you want more stories like this, real historical mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who loves digging into the past. Thank you for listening.